Boker Tov, Haverim. Good morning, my friends. Bruchim Habayim. Blessed are those who've come to gather here in my virtual study. We are here for another cup of Kabbalah. Oh, different cup, a cup of ascents. And that's what we're going to be talking about, ascending. All right, so I know for many of you, what you've really been curious about is that part of mysticism that most of us think means mysticism, which is to have an encounter with God, to experience God closely, or even to merge with God, to have, we have many terms for it in English, a transcendent experience, a unico mystica, that is a mystical union, these sort of things. This is what we normally mean when we say mysticism. And up to this point, what I've been sharing with you is those aspects of Kabbalah that are theophacy, intellectual analysis, trying to understand the mind of God, and doing so on an intellectual level. It leads to certain teachings, doctrines, things like this. But I think most of us, what captivates us most is the idea that we personally, subjectively, can experience God in a more direct fashion than is common here in the modern era. So I'm going to take really 2 sessions to talk about this aspect of the Kabbalistic world. So we're going to begin before the beginning. I've told you several times that Spanish Kabbalah, classical Kabbalah, or just Kabbalah begins around the 13th century in the Iberian Peninsula and in southern France, but there were mystical movements that preceded it. So, and these various early Jewish mystical movements, often a big feature of what they wanted and what they pursued as goals was a more direct experience of the divine. Now, they don't all have the same methodology, nor do they all have necessarily the same goals. So I'm just going to make a list of some of the things they're trying to achieve, and then we'll talk about how they achieve it, and then we'll transition into how classical Kabbalah deals with this. All right, so one of the earliest Jewish mystical movements is called the Maaseh Merkavah, the Merkavah mystics. There is a literature closely related to them that generally goes by the title Hechalot, palaces, literature of the palaces. And this is pretty much the way you would imagine mystical ascent. The idea that you, through astral projection, soul projection, can approach the divine realms and at the very least have a glimpse of divinity, if not actually stand in the presence of divinity. And at the risk of being reductionist, it's a little bit like a game of Donkey Kong, right? You want to get from one level to the next, and it's not easy to do because one of the ideas is that these higher spiritual realms are dangerous for us material beings. And even if our soul is disembodied, we're not supposed to be there, at least not until we die. And therefore, the idea that we should go as living entities into these higher realms places us at risk. There are guardian angels, there are divine forces, there are things that will mislead us, confuse us, deceive us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the Hechalot mystics develop a whole series of methods for these meditative processes. Some of them will be quite obvious for anybody who's engaged in meditation. So the Hechalot mystics fast, self-isolate, engage in preparatory, purifying activities such as immersing oneself in water repeatedly, usually a lake or a river or something like that, studying preparatory texts to alter their frame of mind, sometimes the use of music, sometimes the use of dance, sometimes stress positions. All of these things allow for achieving what we in the modern perspective would call altered states of consciousness. These are tried and true methods that you can find in many cultures for having this. So what we don't have that's as obvious as in some other cultures is chemical alteration. It's not that it isn't there, it's definitely there. So I started a long time ago thinking about the Middle East has always had hashish. Why do we never hear anything about hashish in Jewish literature? Well, there's two possibilities. Either it was so forbidden that we didn't even talk about it, which seems unlikely, or it was commonplace. It didn't seem remarkable, and therefore no one remarked on it. And I think probably the latter is the case. I bet hashish was used. We certainly know that cannabis was used. The study of ancient Israelite altars, the incense altars, and we've looked at the chemical composition of the things that were burned on these little censers or incense altars, and cannabis is among the residue there. So I don't know that I need to comment more, but it put us in a more godly frame of mind and made us more accessible to the divine. So that's Hechalot literature. Then we see another group. There's the Circle of the Unique Cherub, which emerged in Europe very early in the Middle Ages. They did visualizations. They tried to visualize a cherub, the angelic entity closest to God, and use that as a mental and spiritual vehicle to ascend and draw close to divinity. So we have a number of these examples. Now, once you get into Kabbalah proper, we see that certainly the most influential Kabbalistic work, Sefer HaZohar, is primarily a work of mystical speculation. It's biblical interpretations, it's attempts to understand how the Sefirot work in the flow from the divine goodness down into the material world. It's a metaphysics book. However, it does also preserve certain practices that seem to be opportunities for adepts and students and masters to enter into communion with the divine in a more intense way. I think I would surprise none of you by saying that one of the chief ways of doing that is by Torah study. The sages of the Zohar engage in Torah study all the time, and it is in that context that many of their revelatory moments happen. The moment when the language gets luminous and the descriptions become supernal is a direct result of Torah study. Now, there are at least two additional mechanisms that have been used in the Zohar to achieve this. Probably three. I'm going to leave it at three, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, number one, going for a nice walk. Walking in nature. We know this. We've experienced this too. And the Hasids of the 18th and 19th century understood this also, that getting out into the world has a real impact on our mind and can be clarifying, can be explosively broadening. We love a beautiful vista, something that makes us feel small and yet part of the world. And in the Zohar, one of the ironies is that most of the major events of revelation or experience of the divine presence happen outdoors. They don't happen in most buildings, and they certainly don't happen in a synagogue. Ironically, it's that a bunch of sages are walking together on a long, maybe physically demanding journey, and suddenly, in the process of a conversation, divine truths start pouring forth. Sometimes visions happen and things are experienced. So that's one method. When it does happen indoors, more often than not, it happens at midnight. Another technique that the Zoharic Kabbalists use is late night Torah study, staying up past your bedtime. And remember, this is the medieval world. So pretty much once the sun has set, you're winding down for the night. But in fact, they would engage in intense study well past their bedtime, well past midnight. And oftentimes the result of this would be some kind of special disclosure from on high, or some moment in which God or angels becomes present for them. Again, I think we have at least a weak analogy for this. For those of us who went to college and we ended up having to stay up for an all-night study session to prepare for the next day, we realized that once at a certain point between sleep deprivation and deep concentration, our mind changes, and sometimes the world opens up for us in a way that it doesn't during the normal hours of the day. Not to be, well, maybe a little bit, but trying not to be flip about this, but this happened quite a bit when I was in rabbinical school. I would be with my study partners. We had to prepare a big text for the next day. We would study it intensely. Understanding did not come easily. We had to translate it. We had to try and understand what they were striving for. And then every once in a while, one of us would just suddenly go, oh, I've got it, right? And all the confusion and all the different possibilities suddenly sweep away, and it all becomes integral. And then oftentimes it goes far beyond the text itself, where someone says, not only is this what it means, but it's connected to what we studied last year, and I read this book about this, and it all fits together. The term we used in my circle for these kinds of moments was a CO, a cognitive orgasm. And it really was a different kind of experience. It was very intense and incredibly satisfying and very thrilling. And I think this is a lot of what the Zohar is talking about when it talks about late night study. And then finally, there are certain states of mind that are cultivated in order to have these experiences. So for example, a lot of times in the Zohar, it talks about a teacher or a student who is so moved by their experience, they start to weep. And that weeping unleashes a broadening of the mind, or a sense of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is in the room with them. And we don't normally think of weeping as a spiritual discipline, but they did. And of course, it's important to remember, we don't just weep because of distress, though oftentimes in the Zohar they do that, but we also weep out of joy. We weep out of relief. And so I actually think they sort of train themselves to have that, because that's going to, if I get all scientific about it, trigger endorphins and release other kinds of endocrinological chemicals in our body that are going to change our perspective and change the way we experience the world. So that's just some things I'm going to draw attention to. next time we talk, I will continue to talk about other methods. I guess the one thing I do want to say is there is no one methodology of reaching the divine in Kabbalah. Different masters, different instructors offer different models and different customs and different practices in order to achieve this. Stress is often used as a means of inducing euphoria. And so I want you to understand that there are many, many different methods. And I will talk about one of the chief methods in our next session, but that is deeply grounded in Jewish tradition. And then some of the other ones that are being used, especially by a branch of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages known as Ecstatic Kabbalah. Yeah, or prophetic Kabbalah. And almost self-explanatory what's going on there, but we'll talk about it more. So I look forward to talking with you at our next session.